Hey guys, what's happening? Niyat here with Film Comics Explained, and today we'll be exploring the 2014 sci-fi thriller Predestination, based on the 1959 short story All You Zombies, written by Robert Heinlein. The film was directed by the awesome Spierig Brothers and stars their longtime collaborator, Ethan Hawke. Now, in order for us to understand the story, we need to first begin with its title, which, incidentally, holds the key to unlocking the meaning behind this cerebral, mind-bending, paradox-exploiting gem of a movie. To define the term predestination, we have two places we can look. For this film, the clearest definition relates to what is known as the predestination paradox. This is a type of closed causal loop in which time travel to the past results in an action that ensures its own fulfillment, where a paradoxical event such as a future self interacting with a past self must occur for a timeline to play out. But this obviously results in the paradoxical question of what came first, which is at the very heart of this film's narrative. The second means of defining the film's title is through a Christian theological definition. Here, predestination is the doctrine that all events have been willed by God, most commonly relating to the fate of each individual soul. This second definition will help shed some light on the meanings and arguments of predestination that lie underneath its time travel thriller surface, tapping into the discussions of free will and determinism that affect us all. The film's narrative weaves backwards and forwards in time, making a short, snappy summary quite difficult to approach. Nevertheless, let's give it a shot. The film starts with our time agent protagonist, Ethan Hawke, who we're going to call Barkeep, attempting to apprehend a terrorist known as the Fizzle Bomber. Barkeep has been sent back in time to this moment in the hope of saving countless lives. Unfortunately, he fails and the bomb goes off in his face, resulting in facial reconstruction being necessary. Insistent on his mission, Barkeep goes further back in time in an attempt to nip the problem in its bud by getting to the Fizzle Bomber earlier. Here, he works in a bar and meets a talkative customer, John. This extensive flashback-driven scene lasts almost half of the film's length as the two talk exploring John's history of growing up as a girl named Jane. Jane essentially had no memory of her parents and failed to fit in at the orphanage she grew up in or find work later down the line. Finally, she found a man who understood her, only to then be abandoned by him, later finding out that she was pregnant with his child. If things couldn't go further downhill, after giving birth, she discovered that she was a hermaphrodite and that the doctors, without her explicit consent, had given her a hysterectomy, turning her into a man, John. Not only this, but while in the hospital, Jane's newborn baby was stolen, never to be seen again. Okay, that's certainly a lot of information, but it's pretty foundational stuff for the whole narrative. After this central scene, Barkeep recruits John to help apprehend the Fizzle Bomber, taking him back in time to, again, try to nip the problem in the bud. Here, John waits for the Fizzle Bomber, but comes into contact with Jane, his past self, who falls in love with the only person that could ever understand her, herself. Barkeep eventually draws John away from Jane, revealing that the man young Jane had fallen in love with was always and will always be John in this timeline. And here things certainly become a little weird, knowing that Jane's baby was a product of having sex with, well, themselves. Not only that, but we're soon privy to the fact that it was Barkeep who stole the baby, taking it back in time 20 years and placing it within an orphanage. As it turns out, Jane's baby is Jane. So not only is John Jane, but Jane gave birth to herself. This quickly spirals, revealing more and more time loops and, by this point, revealing the inevitable twist that Barkeep is John's future self, and even that the Fizzle Bomber who they're chasing is another future version of Barkeep. So to be clear, every major character we see in the film is pretty much the same character. Jane, John, Jane's baby, Barkeep, and the Fizzle Bomber are all one and the same, albeit at different points in the same timeline. After understanding this convoluted narrative, it's of course necessary to reconsider and recontextualize the information which came before, as knowing that Barkeep is John's future self changes their conversation entirely. Most notably, we must acknowledge that Barkeep knows that John is his past self, as he will have experienced this exact moment many years ago, albeit from the other side of the counter. As such, Barkeep's quips about the chicken and the egg and Ouroboros, the ancient serpent depicted eating its own tail, take on a whole new meaning. In many ways, Barkeep is playing his part. He goads John into friendship, into traveling back in time, into meeting his past self, and reenacting the timeline as to ensure the closed causal loop of the predestination paradox is never broken, to ensure that Barkeep can and will exist. As any breach in the timeline would result in an alternative type of paradox known as a consistency paradox. These are the kind of paradoxes that involve going back to change the future. for example, to kill Hitler or create shenanigans in the 50s. But of course, if you change your own timeline, as explored in the film Looper, you yourself will cease to exist. Here, the explorations of free will and determinism appear center stage, as John has no choice but to become barkeep and place Jane's baby in the orphanage, as the alternative is, at least seemingly, to not exist. And here again, we can reconsider Barkeep's earlier line where he says,
I guess you could say, we were born into this job.
It's basically shifted from the usual turn of phrase into a literal form. But then we have to ask, why does Barkeep keep the loop going past this point? Surely, if he's born and exists, after that point, he can do anything he likes, provided he's dissociated from any form of self. Well, of course, it isn't that simple. Barkeep and thus John are agents of a time-traveling unit, which insists that they must complete their mission to prevent the Fizzle Bomber from killing thousands, and the punishment for changing the timeline beyond this is nothing less than death itself. Because of this, they are again met by the ultimate roadblock of ceasing to exist. So they must continue along this predetermined path, which inevitably results in them becoming the Fizzle Bomber, and thus becoming the target they are tasked to kill, closing the loop for good. Despite the film's lack of religious symbolism, it's important here to recall the film's title, which umbilically ties itself to the Christian concept of predestination. As previously defined, this version of predestination argues that all events have been set on a predetermined path by God, completely obliterating the idea of human free will. But in contrast to the predestination of humanity, Christianity also suggests God's impassibility. This suggests the fact that God himself is in no way causally dependent and does not experience pleasure, pain, or emotion in a human sense. Putting aside the idea of a God figure for a moment, this focus on emotion and the lack of emotion as the alternative to predestination has ramifications in our narrative. As Barkeep finally enters the laundromat where the Fizzle Bomber, his later self, is dwelling, ready to commit his crime, they have a heated conversation. The Fizzle Bomber attempts to persuade Barkeep not to kill him and instead go on a different path, forewarning that if he pulls the trigger, that is an act which sets in motion his path to becoming the Fizzle Bomber. It's also important to remember that by this point, Barkeep has attempted to deactivate his time-traveling device, making him as good as dead if he was rediscovered by the temporal agency he works for. As the clearly delusional Fizzle Bomber attempts to convince Barkeep to spare his life, logic, as with much human interaction, fails in place of emotion. Barkeep gets fixated on the feelings of shame that he could become this terrorist, repeatedly saying,
I'll never become you.
It's an emotive rupture so great that all 6 bullets from his revolver end up lodged in the Fizzle Bomber's chest. As such, it was Barkeep's inability to contain his emotions that resulted in him inevitably becoming the Fizzle Bomber and forcing this eternal loop to repeat itself as Jane gives birth and is born again in a never-ending paradox. But if emotion is Barkeep's downfall, what is the alternative? Well, we get a pretty good look at the embodiment of impassibility with Robertson, played by Noah Taylor. Robertson is fundamental to the story, but remains distant, emotionally detached, and, most importantly, he's the one pulling the strings. Robertson lies in the background shaping Jane's story. He's there at the beginning. He goads her into the Space Corps, which turns out to be the temporal agency she ends up working for. He keeps Barkeep's missions on track, floats between time zones, and, in the end, it turns out it was Robertson who created this paradox in the first place, in an experiment to create an agent who has no ties to time by being both their own creation and undoing. In this way, we can see Robertson as God to Barkeep's predestined man. Robertson seems emotionally detached from a human perspective, but in fact is simply impassible, while Barkeep, Jane, and John all fall folly to human emotion, desire, love, and hate. This interpretation places predestination into the realm of allegory for the distance between God and mankind, turning into a bleak exploration of human futility. And although when John asks, "Do I have a choice?" is rebutted with the line, "No, but you do have a purpose," the argument of having purpose in life without free will shatters in the face of modern, individualist beliefs that personal freedom should be valued above all else. Intrinsically, Predestination's themes contain great provocations of what it means to be human in the face of determinism, blended with the somewhat futile, outdated argument shaped around a fascinating but self-interested time travel paradox thought up in the 1950s by science fiction genius Robert Heinlein. Despite the fact that it relies heavily on overextended dialogue sequences, repeated plot reveals, and the film being hell-bent on being confusing, through the use of its clever cinematography, color, design, acting, and pacing, the film manages to tell an engaging, intriguing, and wholly original story. To me, Predestination is a bit of a conundrum. It points towards hugely discussed topics of free will and determinism, but at times fails to progress towards any solid conclusions, as has been the case since mankind could think with the question, do I have a choice, being as resonant today as it was millennia ago. But perhaps this is the inevitable result of a film which so wholeheartedly bows down to the idea of determinism, bleakly opposing the concept of free will which today's world is so built upon. Either way, it certainly leaves you with a lot to think about, and I'm curious to hear what you guys thought about the film, so please let me know in the comments below. With that having been said, that's all for today, folks. Don't forget to hit subscribe and click the notification icon to stay up to date on all my content, and if there's anything else you'd like to request, please don't hesitate to ask. As always, it's been a pleasure. Niyat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.
What comes first, the chicken or the egg?
The rooster.
You ever think about that, though?
About what?
About what comes first.